Welcome to the Industrial Control System Information Sharing and Analysis Center's monthly public briefing. Today we have a special update on the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, co-hosted by the ISAC and DCT Associates. During the next 90 minutes, we'll take what I'm sure at times may be a hard-hitting look at crucial lessons learned about the benefits and challenges of implementing the framework and how the framework continues to evolve. We'll look at effective approaches for ensuring that the framework can help not only cybersecurity practitioners in general, but those on the front lines dealing with cyber-physical systems. And finally, we'll conclude by exploring the path forward to help guide you toward improving your cybersecurity practices and in turn minimize potential cyber threats. My name is Debbie Wendell and I will be moderating today's session. I serve as Community Director for the ICS-ISAC and oversee the Center's human-to-human information dissemination mechanisms. If you're not yet aware of our full lineup of offerings, make sure that you check out our LinkedIn group, Twitter feed, and website blog posts, as well as our updated events page highlighting our new briefing lineup to be rolled out after we return from our Atlanta Fall Conference in September. Today's briefing, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, Lessons Learned at the 6-month mark, features a panel of distinguished subject matter experts, including Kevin Morley, Security and Preparedness Program Manager at the American Water Works Association, Perry Pederson, Co-founder and Managing Principal at the Langner Group, Greg Witte, Program Manager of the Security Standards Team at G2, and we also have Jaap Schekkerman from CGI, who will be joining us from the Netherlands, who was a late addition to our panel, and we're excited to have him join us. Cynthia Brumfeld, President of and Independent Analyst at DCT Associates, will be facilitating today's event. During today's presentation, Chris Blask, Chair of the ICS-ISAC, and Cynthia will take the first few minutes to lay out some background information to frame the issue. Then, each panelist will be introduced and have the opportunity to present their opening remarks. Next, the panel will spend about 35 to 40 minutes for their discussion. And finally, there will be time for questions and answers and open discussion at the end of their presentation. At any point during the call, if you'd like to enter a question, you may type it into the chat box in the GoToWebinar application. If you would also include your industry affiliation along with that so we know who's entering the question. After the meeting, a recording of this session will be available on the Center's website. So now, without any further delay, Cynthia, over to you.
Thank you, Debbie. Yes, that's me, Cynthia Brumfield. I'm an analyst. I have my own consulting practice, DCT Associates, and I've got a deep background in telecommunications and technology, and over the past couple of years have focused on cybersecurity. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. That we have quite a distinguished set of attendees and quite a few of you out there, and I'm gratified to see the level of interest in this issue because the NIST Cybersecurity Framework has been a major initiative in the cybersecurity arena, and we thought it was time to check in 6 months after the framework was released to see what's going on. What I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes to recap what's occurred to date and what's going on now and what's going to happen in the near future. As you can see from the slide, in February of 2013, President Obama sort of got the framework process rolling when he issued an executive order and a presidential policy directive asking NIST to develop the framework. Over the course of the year that followed that, from February 2013 to February 2014, NIST hosted 5 public workshops. They issued actually 1 RFI and solicited comments from thousands of people, and they engaged in a lot of meetings with a lot of critical infrastructure sector groups to hammer the framework into place. And then in February of 2014, NIST issued the framework, and along with a roadmap for further evolution of the framework to address issues that the framework itself could not come to grips with, such as supply chain and a host of other issues. So where are we 6 months later? That's what's happened. That's how the framework came about. While in concomitant with the release of the framework in February 2014, the Department of Homeland Security launched something called the Critical Infrastructure Cyber Community, or C3 or C-cubed voluntary program that aimed to help the industry increase cyber resilience, to increase the awareness and use of the framework, and to encourage organizations to manage cybersecurity as part of an all-hazards approach to enterprise risk management. Many of you who are listening to this webinar today, and certainly thousands of others, have participated in the C-cubed program, where sector by sector and bit by bit, industry experts and cybersecurity specialists are sort of digging into the framework, figuring out how to adapt it to their relevant industries, and figuring out how to evolve it so that it better suits their interests. I won't go through each of these, but there's a lot of activity going on at, under the C-cubed program at DHS. Here are sort of 4 points that I listed straight from the C-cubed website, where industry participants and specialists and sector coordinators and other folks who are involved in cybersecurity can get involved and sort of really put, you know, some elbow grease into implementing the framework and enhancing their cybersecurity postures. Some other activities that are going on in terms of where NIST is concerned, since the release of the framework and through today, NIST is out there, they're hitting the road, they're hitting the hustings, they're engaging in community awareness, they're soliciting feedback from a host of critical infrastructure organizations and companies and trade associations and groups. They're collaborating with infrastructure owners and operators and the government and industry leaders and other stakeholders to make sure that the framework can, you know, continue to be embraced and adopted. Again, many of you on this call may have participated in a lot of these efforts by NIST. I would also say on the NIST Cybersecurity Framework website, there are more details in terms of how NIST is getting out there and how NIST is trying to continue to keep its hand into play and making sure the framework is, you know, adopted and used. They are also engaging a lot of efforts surrounding the roadmap. This is the area where they thought there could be further improvements, such as, I mentioned supply chain, but there are at least 4 or 5 other areas that the framework doesn't address, but they're working with a lot of groups to see how they might be able to incorporate different aspects that weren't really weaved into the framework, how they might be able to sort of accommodate that. It's worth noting, and I'm sure many of you know, that NIST referred to its framework as the Framework 1.0. They very strongly view this as a living document, something that's going to be evolving and growing over time. And so there's just a ton of efforts. Again, I refer you to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework website, and I'll look that up at the end of this call, make sure that you have it so that you can stay abreast of all the things that are going on. Another thing that they did, they issued a Cybersecurity Framework reference tool, which is a FileMaker database where interested parties and stakeholders can browse the framework core by functions, categories, subcategories, informative references, search for specific words. In other words, just play around with it to see how they can perhaps tailor or remap or otherwise reconfigure the framework for their specific purposes. Any day now, in fact, even as we speak, NIST plans to release a formal request for information asking for further feedback on the framework, the current awareness, how people are experiencing it, how they're adopting it, and any other related activities. What they plan to do with this RFI is sort of synthesize and sort of agglomerate all the responses that they've received to better inform sort of the next step that is a little more official than some of the things we've been talking about, and that is they're going to be hosting yet another workshop in October informed by this RFI at the Florida Center for Cybersecurity located at the University of South Florida in Tampa, October 29th and October 30th. At that workshop, they'll sort of take into account all the information they've received in the RFI. They'll examine it in terms of how the framework has been implemented, what the experiences have been to date, and then potentially come up with some next steps in terms of how the framework continues to evolve. Let's see. You can go ahead, Debbie. A couple of other things worth noting. Since the framework was released, a number of government agencies have actually incorporated it into their ongoing responsibilities in some fashion or another. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, the EPA, the DOE, the Treasury Department, and a number of state-level agencies have either referenced the framework in terms of how they want to see relevant stakeholders behave, or in terms of suggested guidance for how folks move forward. This is a really interesting area as the years go by. This is one of the big concerns a lot of folks had when the framework was under development, which is, will this become sort of a mandatory regulatory government document? And to date, none of the activities by the government agencies that I've seen have made it mandatory, but it certainly is cropping up in a lot of official activities. And then there's a sort of a separate area where a lot of activity is occurring, and that has also happened since the framework was released, and that is an intense focus on technical privacy standards and how they interrelate and weave into the framework. NIST held a privacy engineering workshop in April. We'll host another one on September 15th and 16th in San Jose. I attended the one in April, and it was quite interesting, but it really seemed to be separate and apart from true cybersecurity activities. At some point, though, there's some belief on the part of NIST and some industry players that how you maintain privacy as a foundational technical matter is very, very much relevant to how you maintain cybersecurity. And at some point, the framework may, in fact, evolve to take on more of the privacy aspects than it does today. That was actually quite a controversial subject as the framework was being developed, and there's a whole story behind that. But for the time being, they have sort of a separate parallel track going on in examining technical privacy standards. And I think there's one more slide. I had a conversation yesterday with Adam Sedgwick, who is sort of the person spearheading the cybersecurity framework at NIST, and I asked him if there's anything he wanted me to relate to this group in terms of what they should be taking away from this webinar, and he said the key message from this to the industry stakeholders are submit comments in the RFI. If you've looked at the framework, if you've adopted it, if you tried to remap it to fit your particular configuration, let NIST know, submit comments. He said even if they're negative, even if they're very critical, we want a healthy debate and we welcome criticism. That was a direct quote from him. His other key point was participate in your sector groups to develop implementation guidance, and just keep working on adopting and implementing the framework and getting some experience in the field. And those are the two things that at this point he suggests you take into account as you move forward with the framework. And I think that's it. Thank you. That's just a recap of what happened, what's going on, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer that during the Q&A portion. And at this point, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Chris Black, who I know for a fact probably has something to say.
You never know. Thank you very much, Cynthia. And I just want to spend a couple minutes to frame this in the broader context. And with the ICS-ISAC, our role is to work on information sharing. That means both threat indicators and so forth. I see one of the questions That's popped up already. We'll get to that later on how it applies or doesn't apply to the NIST framework. But also an understanding of solutions and opportunities and when the right time is to do things. So in that context, I'm at the beginning of this process with resulted in the framework is saying that generally speaking, anybody that didn't think that the U.S. federal government would take a step something like this about now, isn't really looking at the history of this. We've been at this by various measures for the last decade or 20 years or 25 years in different perspectives. And you can expect as we move through time that certain things are going to happen. In the years leading up to the executive order and now the cybersecurity framework, the Congress has taken various efforts at legislation. There's a lot of conversation about that, a lot of criticism, a lot of support, hasn't led to anything. So with the rising threat to critical infrastructure, by all means, and which is another subtopic, there is this confusion of is banking critical infrastructure? Well, yes, but it's not cyber physical anyways. But with the rising threat to those infrastructures, all the attacks we've seen from Heartland payment systems, Target, and so on and so forth, and the embedding foundational aspect of IT and ICS systems. It used to be 10 and 20 years ago that IT was something you did. Now it's really something you are. And we as a nation have a strategic, economic, and national need to make sure that we continue to function as an entity, as an economy, and so forth. So these sorts of issues have been finding their way into the federal level, into the congressional level, and now, of course, into the executive level. So something was bound to happen. And when we look at this, it's with our panel today, we've got great representation. Perry has been involved on both sides of this forever, has I know a few things to say that's great. And Kevin with the American Water Works Association has been working on this from the industry side forever. For my part, I'm relatively pleased. We've seen through some of the potential legislation different possible outcomes and regulations and imposements by the federal government. And all of us as security professionals tend to worry about that. By definition, if you're not doing cybersecurity for a living, you probably don't know exactly what the state of the art and the fine points are. So when we lock something into legislation and regulation, we get the compliance instead of security problem that we all know. And of those mentioned, Heartland and Heartland Payment Systems was PCI compliant, but they lost 600 million credit cards. And you can say the same thing as incident by incident as we look through the standards and regulations and forced requirements that have come out. So given that something was going to happen, to have it come out in generally the form that it has, with this emphasis on the word voluntary framework and so forth, not to come down as legislating that we use standards that perhaps are already out of date, is not a bad outcome. And really what we want to achieve from all these sorts of things is, rather than to force people to comply with specific activities, to encourage all of the associated players to take steps that result in a more secure infrastructure. So what we've seen now with the act by the executive branch of the U.S. federal government in taking these sorts of steps, that is, what we've seen that is much more important to me than perhaps many of the details in this, is conversations between insurance carriers and asset owners. We see these issues moving from the middle management technical level into the board level. We see the large, mature mechanisms that we have as a nation and that ramify worldwide, that organizations are moving in generally the right direction. And again, without necessarily focusing on specificity, it may or may not be entirely right. So my last comment before I pass it over is that I think the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is a reasonable physician's desk reference, basically an index into existing standards that have been worked through, for better or worse, generally better, by the industry to date. And there isn't really anything in there that an organization shouldn't be doing, and that it's in a relatively logical format. and anyone who can be critical of large organizations or national governments, or particularly our national governments. I don't really know anybody who can't be critical of them. It's reasonable to assume that you have a couple options. Either something's going to come out really horribly bad or not so bad. So on that level, I'm pretty happy with the way it's come out. And with that, I will rest the gavel and pass it back to Debbie, who can introduce the first of the panelists to have their say.
Actually, I'm going to introduce all four of them at one time. This will be something different. As Security and Preparedness Program Manager for the American Water Works Association, or AWWA, Kevin Morley is responsible for collaborating with various regulatory agencies to ensure that the perspectives of AWWA's membership, as well as the water sector in general, are considered in the policy decision-making process. In addition, he is responsible for enhancing water sector security and preparedness capabilities by supporting the development of AWWA standards and initiatives, including the Water Wastewater Agency Response Network that can be found at nationalwarn.org. Perry Pederson began protecting critical infrastructure with the Department of Defense and continued that effort as Director of the Control Systems Security Program at the Department of Homeland Security. While at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, he helped build the regulatory framework for cybersecurity at U.S. nuclear power reactors and has consulted with the International Atomic Energy Agency. He received the SANS Process Control SCADA Security Leadership Award and served as an inaugural member of the governing board for the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel. Earlier this year, Perry joined with Ralph Langner to develop a new approach to securing industrial control systems called the Robust Industrial Control Systems Planning and Evaluation, or RIPE, framework. As Program Manager for Security Standards at G2, Greg Witte supports federal civilian clients, primarily for the NIST Computer Security Division, where he assists both internal and external customers in performing integration planning and offers technical delivery on a broad range of cybersecurity topics, including identity management, industrial controls, policy and compliance, and security automation. During 2013, Greg drew on his depth and breadth of cyber experience and served as a core member of their team in creation of the cybersecurity framework. His extensive knowledge helped develop a common language for communicating, assessing, and reporting cybersecurity risk management objectives. Joop Schukkerman from CGI is joining us from the Netherlands. He provides a unique global perspective to the mix today and brings nearly 40 years of cyber experience to the table. With that, back to you, Cynthia.
Okay, and Kevin, I'm going to make you presenter since I believe you have some slides you'd like to share, so hopefully that will pop up on your screen. And you can, there you go, we see your screen.
Got me? All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with the ICS-ISAC and hear a little bit more from some of the folks on the call, but I'm going to give you a little bit of industry perspective on the water side and a kind of little overview of where we're at, where we've been, and where we're headed. So bear with me here for a minute. From a water sector perspective, obviously over time, many of our assets and operations have become more and more automated for various reasons, whether it be workforce compression and the efficiencies afforded by automation, but also in the case of energy and pumping, some of the optimization sequences that can be derived from that kind of automation, which and also obviously some of the more advanced metering systems that are coming online that are not dissimilar to the technologies being applied in the energy sector. I think from an awareness perspective, Y2K was probably the first time that our sector and perhaps many others kind of thought about their vulnerabilities to that aspect of their operations. But and then in 2002, the Bioterrorism Act required water utilities, drinking water utilities, to do vulnerability assessments, which included an analysis of your cyber and other enterprise and SCADA systems By 2008, a group of utilities had come together under a workshop that AWWA facilitated along with DHS to kind of understand what challenges remained in advancing the water sector's capabilities and application of some of the principles that we've heard from and in fact manifested themselves eventually in the NIST framework. And that roadmap there is really a gap assessment of some of the challenges. And part of it is just on the drinking water side alone, there's over 56,000 community water systems. So any given system isn't really a kind of a market maker, if you will, and be able to drive technology in a certain direction to meet our needs. So that was recognized there, including the need for kind of some recognized best practices to enable utilities to take action on some of these things. The last document that I'd note there, that roadmap to a secure and resilient water sector, that's a joint strategic plan of the Water Sector Coordinating Council and the Water Sector Government Coordinating Council. And in 2013, we collectively agreed that one of the number one priority was the advancement and the development of sector-specific cybersecurity resources. This, in part, reflected some of the activities that have been underway here in the water sector, and AWWA is an ANSI standards development organization, and as you can see here, we have a number of standards that address the need for appropriate security protocols, and this is part of one aspect of doing what Chris was talking about, and leads to the larger objective of the executive order, a path towards institutionalization of cybersecurity, not so much from a compliance perspective, but as a normal business practice, which I think what Chris was alluding to. And so those first two standards have been granted Safety Act designation from DHS, so that's a nice thing in kind of giving a strong signal to the sector to proceed to follow those protocols. And then I'm going to spend the rest of the time on the last item there about the new resource we've developed, which is very much aligned with the NIST framework, and I'll explain that more in a moment. So obviously, I don't need to speak to this. Cynthia did a great job doing an overview of the EO and the NIST framework, but again, it's voluntary guidance, and we don't have any issue with that. We find that to be a useful platform. But from an operator perspective, remember, most of our folks are not, technologists, if you will. A document like this is quite intimidating. It'd be like me dropping a document on treatment operations and coagulation and flocculation on some of the folks on the call. That would be Greek to y'all probably. So this was a little bit abstract. So we felt we needed a different approach, and in fact. At the same time that the executive order was issued, we had initiated a project to develop guidance for the water sector, with the primary focus being building knowledge at the utility management level, because that's really where, from a cultural perspective, we needed to have buy-in on this issue, and to make the issue a little bit more tangible. I think none of you would disagree with the idea that it can be an intimidated issue if you're not conversant in all the details of some of the standards that are part of that framework. It becomes a little bit overwhelming, which leads to kind of some paralysis and therefore inaction in the absence of a clear path forward. And so what we were trying to overcome in the development of this resource was to enable and empower utilities to take action on some of these basic controls that can be done. And so this guidance document is organized from a utility operations approach. I would note that it doesn't evaluate the actual security profile, but it provides an approach based on how the utility uses the technology. So you'll see here in a minute when I switch over to the couple of screenshots of the tool that accompanies this guidance, what I'm talking about. But as a result of that, it provides a prioritized list of controls that a utility should be applying based on their particular application of the technology, which really, to put it in simple terms, really is very empowering to utility, because that puts it in an appropriate contextual framework that they can then understand why they need to do X, Y, and Z particular activity in order to better secure their system. So the use case tools is based on 82 cybersecurity controls. In fact, we've roadmapped the controls to the NIST framework, and I think we probably nearly have 100% alignment with those things, and it just happens that we've organized the measures and controls in a slightly different sequence based on our own contextualization of the information, so that it makes sense to us. And that's not to disparage the efforts of NIST. In fact, I think that it was a good initial effort, and but they had the challenge of speaking to 16, 17 different sectors all at the same time, so that makes it a little bit difficult. So again, as a user goes through the tool, it provides a prioritized list, and those are derived from SMEs that we had involved with the project, and where a priority one or your kind of basic what I would call basic cyber hygiene. Now, these are things you should do immediately. No questions asked, irrespective of your size or type of utility. It really shouldn't be any different. And then 2, 3, and 4, kind of a different level of thing, acknowledging the fact that we don't have infinite budgetary resources. So this is a way for a utility to kind of get a grip as to what types of things they can do, and then sequence in to their budgetary process how they may tackle some of these issues if they are in fact outstanding. So this is a screenshot of the landing page at www.aww.org/cybersecurity. You can access the guidance, which is a little bit more descriptive of the core competency areas, and a little bit of an introduction for kind of utility management to understand what they're asking for, and then they can turn to their guy on staff like Chris and say, hey, are we doing these things, and how are we doing with this? And if they find that they have some gaps, well, now they've got a good actionable list that they can work on with a consultant or internally to overcome some of those things. The tool, again, that's freely accessible, and the only thing that is required is to create a free user account on the AWA website. And the purpose of that is simply to acknowledge the terms of use. So this is a little bit of an example of what I meant by use case. So many of our systems, as you might imagine, have remote operations that are not near the administration building or the pumps or the treatment plant, especially some of our more rural systems that have kind of reservoir systems or groundwater systems that are far away. And as you might imagine, on a weekend or in the middle of the night, if there's an issue, they may be able to want to remotely access that asset and potentially have some controls over the pump or what have you. And so based on that use case, you would click on Generate Report for this particular asset. It would generate this report, remind the user of what the different priorities mean, and then as you move down, you get a reminder of what your use case scenarios are, so you can kind of remember what is going on. And then you get this list of priority recommended controls that you can then evaluate whether or not those particular controls are actually in place at your system. And you'll notice that we provide a direct reference to the source of the control based on the various standards or materials that may be available from DHS or other organizations. So we didn't recreate anything. We didn't write new standards. We just tried to kind of normalize how our utilities can benefit from these things and kind of organize them in a way that makes it actionable for them, because they're very unlikely to go read all these different things independently. So we've kind of, this is something that I put forward to some colleagues here just in the past few weeks. Look at this as a one-step-at-a-time approach, and the fact that the AWA guidance and use case tool, which aligns with the NIST cybersecurity framework, is kind of your kind of entry level, get folks in the tent and familiarized with the issue. Our Sector Coordinating Council has acknowledged that that resource does represent the sector's foundation for adoption of the NIST framework. So that's a good start, and we've seen quite a bit of traffic and acknowledgement of that, and a number of utilities beginning to use that tool, and those numbers continue to go up daily. But for the more advanced utilities, I think part of the challenge that we have is how to sequence how these different resources work together to build the security that Chris and Cynthia were talking about, and is indeed the objective in this framework. And so part of what we're trying to deal with in our sector is how do we kind of organize these things in a way to show a progressive level of complexity, if you will, in the sophistication and the application of these different systems to support the security needs of a utility. So, you know, you move from our guidance to, say, the CSAT tool, and then these are all things supported by ICS CERT, and there's some great resources there that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about. To try to wrap things up, back in May, we did get a nice boost of confidence from our partners at US EPA. I won't read all of this, but they essentially acknowledged that in part the fact that we had developed this resource, they felt they didn't have a need to develop any further resources for the sector, and that they concurred that it did serve to support the sector's implementation of the NIST framework. So that's very encouraging, and we are continuing to work through that process of larger outreach similar to this through a SIPAC process, and the key tasks there are appropriate approaches to outreach and training, similar to part of the reason I was glad to be invited to be part of this, is to broaden the audience, leverage those existing programs. And I think the last item there about measures of success that can be tracked, it gets back to Chris's question of you know, there is a desire for kind of regulatory concurrence, if you will, to have that assurity that all these different critical infrastructures are doing the right thing. At the same time, I'm a firm believer that the owner-operator needs to take ownership of the risk, whether there's a regulatory mandate or not, because it does get at the core mission of their operations. So we're trying to explore some what I might call key motivators or incentives to inform utilities that may not be fully aware of this, how important it is to take this very seriously and take action on this without being unnecessarily threatening, but again, trying to convey return on investment, if you will, for something that is very difficult to observe the benefit of. Is something we're wrestling with and hope to learn more from folks like the other panelists on the call, how other sectors may be doing that. So that kind of wraps me up, Chris. Happy to take questions at the end of the session, and again, appreciate the opportunity. There's my contact information for any folks that are need to reach out to me. But again, appreciate the opportunity to be part of the discussion today.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Kevin.
Go ahead, Cynthia. I'm going to take the screen back here, and Perry's up next.
Okay.
If you have slides you want to show, just say the word and it's all yours.
Okay, so I think our next speaker is Perry Pederson from the Langner Group. Perry, what are your thoughts? What's your sense of where we are?
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for a great overview, and thanks to Chris for a good context-setting statement. And I'd hate to start off with arguing with Chris, but everyone's allowed their own opinion. And so in my view, I think you can look at the NIST CSF as a success. You could say it's not a bad outcome. And I believe that you could really only say that if you had really low expectations. And so my perspective is, when I look back on what the stated purpose of the framework was, what the executive order actually charged NIST to do, when I look at that, I see it failed. It fell way short. And as Chris mentioned, I was on the other side of this fence during the early days and the formation of the various agency working groups working on this project. And you could see it happening for those of us who've been involved in standards organizations before. You can see a certain measure of groupthink going on, and but the point is, and this is said, this will evolve. But my perspective is, as it stands now, and compared to what its stated goal was. So I have three main points. One is compliance to the NIST CSF only requires adopting the terminology. If you speak in those terms and talk in those terms, you can actually be compliant with the framework without changing anything that you actually do. You may have to generate different kinds of paper, different kinds of reports, and use different words, but it's really a business-friendly framework because it allows the business to decide, based on its needs and its resources, to simply cherry pick what it wants. You've got your framework core, you've got your profile, implementation tiers, and there's a lot of detail there and a lot of links to existing standards and things that are pretty good, but there's nothing compelling in there. There's no forcing function that says you have to do any of this. The second point is it lacks the details needed to really fill the gap between concept and practice. And perhaps you could say, well, that's by design. That's for the asset owners to come up with how they fill that gap. But in my experience, what I see time and again is the asset owners, and I'm talking more in terms of the guys with boots on the ground, is that they need a little more help in bridging that gap. Don't just tell them they need better policies and procedures and implement controls and increase your posture and so on. What they need is a little more detailed help, at least provide one example of how to actually achieve the end state. And the third thing, and I've already alluded to this, is I think that the NIST CSF is fundamentally flawed from a policy perspective. So I can always hope for the best. I hope that it will evolve and get better, but I don't think that hope is a very effective strategy. So back to my first point, just to elaborate a little further on that, it does provide a conceptual model for how to think and talk about. And so as far as that goes, you could even consider that progress. There's the framework core, there's the profile, there's the implementation tiers. But for example, if you and your organization don't believe that a physical system inventory is important, or you think it would be too costly, you simply kick it out of the profile and document that fact, and you are now compliant. So it's a very business-friendly framework because it's these business drivers and resources that are the guiding principles for creating your profile, not increased security. And as I mentioned about the original purpose of the executive order, and I'm sure you all have read that, but within the framework itself, the CSF says organizations should determine the desired tier, ensuring that their selected level meets organizational goals, it's feasible to implement, and reduces cybersecurity risk to critical assets and resources to levels acceptable to the organization. So I just think about this, and I wonder how any organization driven by profit will make the decision that enhances our national security. And that was the original goal of this. In fact, if I use our president's words, this framework was not designed to protect a cookie factory. It was designed to protect systems and assets, whether physical or virtual, so vital to the United States that the incapacity or destruction of such systems and assets would have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination of these matters. So those are the President's words, not mine. And so when I look at what the framework has delivered, I see a huge gap between the two. And because of this business-friendly language that's in the framework, I really don't have to do much, and I can still claim that I'm compliant. One of the things that are not addressed in the framework are systemic risks. These are risks in critical infrastructure that really emerge when you look at it on a national scale. In other words, the system is more than a sum of its parts. And so it's just unreasonable to imagine that individual entities are going to make the right decision, which will probably increase their cost to the appropriate level to provide national security protection. One of the things that Ralph and I mentioned time and again is this basic notion that insecure systems, architectures, designs, and procedures are inherently more convenient, more flexible, and less expensive than secure ones. So none of this actually holds up under rigorous business requirements. So if the reduction of cyber risk would really be in the best interest of business owners, there would be no need for the government to provide this advice. If there was inherent value in reducing cyber risk, there would be no need for external incentives. That the incentive would be built in, but that's not the case. The other thing that the CSF does that I think can be misleading is if you're compliant to the framework and you say that your organization is then compliant to this framework, it creates a false sense of security. And this doesn't provide any detail on what's really meant by a lot of these things in the framework. Again, that may well be by design, but the folks that are implementing security on the ground need a bit more than that. One example touching again on the issue of inventories, which a lot of people understand. What does a hardware inventory look like? What do security policies look like? In real life on the plant floor, what I've seen many times is hardware inventories are typically incomplete and outdated Excel spreadsheets. And this is just not a very good approach. However, this approach would be fully compliant with the NIST framework. So it really just introduces way too much variability. You know, the classic statement of having 3 experts will generate at least 4 opinions, I think is even more true in this case. Because of the lack of consistent interpretation and implementation, it just introduces too much variability. And in the plant floor, that's the killer. That's what we need to reduce, is variability. And then if we take a closer look at, say, all of those activities that are recommended by the framework, the framework never tells us how to actually implement those activities in even one way that would match what was intended. So it places the complete burden on the end user. Again, perhaps that was by design, but I see a rather large gap in the industry, and folks are asking for help. And just for a brief commercial, that's what Ralph and I try to do, is plug that gap with our framework. And this framework is all of those NIST subcategories. We have operationalized them and turned them into procedures that can be objectively verified and measured. But if you want any information on that, you can, of course, go to our website and read about the right framework. The other problem that I see in the NIST framework is this basic concept of managing risk. And for more detail on that, I would refer you back to a paper that Ralph and I wrote in early 2013, published by Brookings, on this idea of managing risk, and we really don't think it's possible, at least in the way that it's being implemented here within this framework. One of the examples that I would point to is in the framework. We've got a couple of categories that refer to that, risk assessment and risk management. But there really is no empirical evidence that I've seen. I would hope to be proven wrong someday, perhaps, but there's no evidence that I've seen that would support the theory that any of these various risk or risk management approaches have actually been successful in cyber physical environments. So I'd certainly like to see NIST make a better effort in that regard.
Right.
So I've only got a couple of minutes left, and I would just like to kind of come back to that. One of my main points is that I wouldn't characterize the CSF framework as successful. Perhaps you could consider it a baby step in a very long journey, but I think there are some huge gaps in here, and I don't think it addresses the main reason for it to be created in the first place. I just refer you to the executive order by President Obama and read that and then read what NIST actually provides. And then think about all the folks that are given this framework and expected to implement it in some consistent way that actually reduces the security vulnerabilities, not just at a single plant or a single sector, but across the board for the entire country.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the things that we're still struggling with. And with my background as a regulator on the nuclear side, it seems pretty clear to me that if we really care about something, we regulate it. We don't leave the operation and the safety and security of a nuclear power plant, for example, to industry best practices.
Right.
It's regulated. And so when I see the government say this real critical infrastructure needs more security, I tend to look at it and say, well, if you want to really achieve that level, you need to do more than just a voluntary program. However, the bottom line to that is that I do think, and I agree with what Kevin said, you know, we can do this. I mean, industry can actually do this, but it's difficult when you're driven by profit to make those investments in better security. But I think that it can be done. I believe that firmly, and that's what Ralph and I have done to try to help asset owners achieve that. I think it is doable. I just don't think that this particular framework actually adds value to that goal. So I'll let that rest for now and take any questions at the end of the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Perry. And I sort of said leading up to this webinar that we'd hear both the good and the bad of the framework, and so far we're being true to our word. Greg, you've heard from Kevin, you've heard from Perry. What are your thoughts on the cybersecurity framework? And Greg's probably on mute. Are you on mute, Greg? Are you guys hearing me?
Greg figures that out. We pass it
we'll move on.
Yap.
Yeah, Yap. We'll go with you, and then Greg, if you're listening, we'll switch to you as soon as Yap has his say. And Yap, tell us what you think.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me to join this panelist today. It was only 1 hour before the meeting, so I was not well prepared, but I have a few slides I want to show you later. Listening to Perry Pederson, and I'm an outsider, not an American. I'm living in the Netherlands, working for CGI, the group in Canada, responsible for global cybersecurity in industrial control systems and critical infrastructures. What I see is, and what I can agree with Perry Pederson, is also my concerns. We within CGI Group have developed, yes, I will show you it now. Okay. We developed over a couple of years a cybersecurity management framework for critical infrastructures that is dealing with the issues of not only about cybersecurity but also about security and also about safety, because you need to have an holistic view from a safety, security and cybersecurity perspective when you look to frameworks. I introduced this framework also in our RFI response to the NIST, and I was a little bit concerned, and a little bit is a small word. I was really concerned what I saw as the outcome of the current version 0.1, because first of all, the framework itself, its structure is okay, but when I look to the content, it is addressing all kinds of what questions, what you need to do, but it never gives you any answer how to do it. And so it's for operators, plant managers, but also for security experts, unusable, because it's referring to all kinds of standards, and if you are not familiar with the standards, you really don't know what to do. So that's my first concern. It's not usable in this way. While the initiative itself is a very good initiative, the outcome, in my words, and I'm very directly, it's bad. It's bad and not usable in the sense that you can use it in real practices. The other confusing point is the tiers, because that are maturity levels. And so you are combining maturity levels with a framework. What type of framework? Is it the governance framework? Is it the management framework? What is the goal and objective of the framework? It's not clear. It's not addressing who are the real audience for. It's dealing with issues who are not in scope. So physical security is key, safety is key, all kinds of other items. So if you look to our framework, which we are using now for several years, what we can see is that you need to address all kinds of elements, and this is our what we call management framework, which you also could call it a governance framework. It's identifying what you need to do and then drill down in detail to show you what you have to do and how to do. And that is completely missing in the NIST framework. And therefore I really need to agree with Pederson that I don't see how you can use this framework in real life, and I don't know how to do it. While when we look to our framework, which is a combination of all the international standards as well as industry best practices, we combined what we have learned in real life in this framework. And while the framework is only a governance framework, you need to have much more other documents and documentation in place in detail before you can implement such a framework in real life. For example, the policies and security policies and data protection policies in critical infrastructures is key to have that drill down. The same is, and this is also missing and not addressed in the NIST framework, is what we call the cybersecurity reference architecture. If you need to, for example, secure 150 plants worldwide, plants in different categories from multi-site, multi-plant, multi-production lines, or a single production line itself, you need to have a reference architecture that is drilling down in all the details of the ISA 99 and ISA 100 levels, and combine that with the best practices, how to define your security zones, how to define your conduits, how to implement the requirements of the conduits in technologies, in procedures, in behavior. You need to combine all these things and write it down in detail so that the plant manager can read it and knows what he needs to do, that an operator knows what is his responsibility. So you need to bring that down in all the details, otherwise it will not be used and it is not usable in real life. And the same is, and Perry also addressed that, is about risk identification and classification and assessment of risks in these environments. This is a complete separate topic what you need to address when you have your asset inventory. And your asset inventory is key as a starting point. I will show you that in a few slides. Yes, I think here it is. What we see in our approach with the CGI, which we're using in different kind of industries, in the oil and gas, in the energy, in transportation, in railways, all kinds of industries, because the interesting part is that 70 to 80% of what you need to do to secure these industrial control system environments is for all the sectors the same. Only at the ends of the production processes there you find the differences. And so what we say is the first item is what we call part 1, is the current asset and risk assessment analysis. And what we see in real life is there are a lot of organizations are struggling with their current assets. So you need to find other ways to have a good view of the current assets in operations, and then probably do your risk assessment. But what we see in real life when we are reviewing these assets, we see all kinds of backdoors open. So you can do a risk assessment, but you know almost the outcome up front. So our approach is then implement first what we call the baseline protection profile, which is dealing with the current level of threats known at this time. And when you have implemented these baseline protection profiles based on the current assets, then do a risk assessment again and see what you need to do more than your baseline protection level, which you need to implement. And implementing that means defining your target reference architecture, your target security reference architecture, and implement this baseline protection profile along with that. And then determine your and analyze your and prioritize your gaps, and define your implementation action plan for this baseline protection level first. Segment your zones, do your identity access control, harden all your systems, and monitor what is going on. So implement all kinds of technologies that you can monitor your devices, your networks, and what is going on. And so you need a much more products. I will go to another slide. Is what you are doing in the industrial control systems environment needs to be aligned with the corporate environment. So it's not only focusing on ICS or SCADA environments, it's a combination of what are you doing from an IT security level on enterprise corporate, in the enterprise corporate environment, and how to align that with your planned production environment, because you need to align these both worlds and work together, while the controls and measures you can implement in the production environment are completely different of what you can do at the corporate level. But it needs to be a holistic view of both worlds with both disciplines in one team. Otherwise, you get a misalignment between the connections on enterprise level and on production level. I move over to one other slide. And this is like the framework itself is only your governance environment, but you need to do a lot of other activities and produce a lot of other materials before you can define how to secure your environment. So you need your policies, your procedures, your requirements, your practices. You need to define all your kind of asset models from different viewpoints. You need to have your reference architecture in place, and then define, based on all the other information, your zones and conduits in the reference architecture, and define how to secure and implement the different levels of defense in depth, as well as your separation of concerns. Those principles are key in what you are doing. And it has to all the time to deal with physical security as well as with the people processes, and it has to do with the risk analysis, your safety and security. So it's combining all kind of knowledge and experience as a whole. And this is the last view I want to show you, is what kind of documents we have in place, created to help organizations quickly come on track in assessing their cybersecurity risk, the security risks, as well as the safety elements of it. So we defined the cybersecurity security baseline requirements for SCADA, industrial devices, embedded devices, the hardware, etc., because it's almost 70 to 80% common to most industries, and you tune it to your specific needs. So back to the NIST framework, what I see is the initiative itself. I really love it, but what I see as the result, as the outcome, my perspective is unusable. And I can repeat what Perry was telling, but I totally agree with him and the statements he made about the framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that was another interesting perspective. And we're going to move on now to Greg. Greg, you're going to be batting cleanup, and it's your turn. Take it away.
Well, that's a tough job with this team. Thank you. I assume it's working now. I do understand those perspectives, and thinking back to what Kevin had said, I think one of the challenges we had in this that I've had the opportunity to work with a small co-op in Maryland, and I've also had the same opportunity to work with an 11,000 employee electric utility. So, I understand some of the challenges, but I also see that by design, this is a voluntary program which was supposed to be able to scale to any size of organization. I've been really encouraged to see, as DHS has rolled out the CQBP, they've had a focus on the small business, and I think that's good. And I think both Perry's group and YOP have, they've got specific ways that can be implemented on the how to take the framework and make it operational. And I think that that's part of the key. The framework was to organize everyone and get everyone working towards the same common language, but it wasn't meant to be a specific technical framework. It was supposed to reference those common industrial standards that people were already using or were moving towards. So I think it's great to see work that like the Langner group has done, and to see efforts like the one Kevin described, being able to work with the ICS cert and to work with the ISACs and to be able to do these things. I think it's actually a sign of success. NIST put out an update not too long ago talking about progress that we're making. It is really about communication and awareness. That is the most important part for this. And if that is being used to drive better risk management opportunities, to better inform governing bodies and executive boards and executive management, to be more aware and to make better risk decisions and to consider the whole good rather than just their pocketbook and short-term gains, then I think that is part of a win. So that's how I would view at least the short-term success. I think we have made, NIST described some of the work that have been done. There's NSTIC pilots. Some of the most recent ICS cert advisories have pointed to just people mistakes. It's not a technical problem. People are still putting MTUs right on the internet with no authentication required. We still have quite a few people-based processes that are not specifically focused on what the technical aspects and whether we have retina scanners to get into the data center. It's really a question of, are we doing the right things the right way, and are we prioritizing those activities the right way? So I was really thrilled to see that in Kevin's model that AWWA has been doing, to be able to take those priorities and to put them in, for example, into a target profile so that you can say, these are the things that I think I need to be doing to accomplish my goals in consideration of cybersecurity requirements. I think that's good, and I think that as a voluntary program, we should not be directing people and making it mandatory. That's up for much more important people than I to say. But to the point that it's a voluntary program where we're trying to help them decide how to prioritize, I think that it is a good start, and tools like what we saw this morning, that's great progress. The reference tool that NIST put out also is helpful in that if you do have familiarity with those controls, you can pivot on each of those different controls or different parts of the framework to understand how that can be taken forward. My group, G2, has had the opportunity to work with ISACA. One of the things that we looked at all through this framework development process was it does work well with many of the existing risk management frameworks that are out there. The one from NIST, of course, but also many others like COBIT. And I think it actually combines well with COBIT. COBIT starts with saying, what are my organization's goals, which should include any regulatory requirements and any responsibilities I have from a corporate standpoint to the cyber critical infrastructure community. And that includes all the operational technology, not just the financial IT type of stuff, but all the way down to all the operational technology. But as I take those needs, can I come up with my primary goals that will derive my mission drivers through which I can do the whole OODA loop and the Deming loop that Jaap was describing? Can we do this in a plan, do, check, act, monitor? Can we do this in a life cycle? And I think you can take this framework core and you can use that to develop an action plan. And in fact, we have worked with ISACA to develop some profile templates, such as a current profile, so I can tell exactly where am I, using those tiers to understand how well am I achieving those goals, and then develop a target profile so that I can understand what are the operational impacts. If I know my critical digital assets, can I do a risk assessment? Can I find ways to mitigate those? Can I do a true operational impact assessment and use that to develop the target profile using questions like the ones that Kevin posed earlier in those use cases? So I think in that process, just having this dialogue and being able to work on these things is good. And yeah, in the interest of time, I'll keep it short, but I think this would be a great conversation to continue down in Tampa at the October workshop. I think that's exactly what NIST has told me that they're looking to do, not just have a bunch of people saying, yes, this is great, and we'll comply in name only, but the goal is to actually understand how does this work. I had a conversation not too long ago with someone at a very, very large defense contracting organization who was looking to use the framework just as an alignment point. They've already got a bunch of compliance frameworks that they have to comply with, but combined with the use of something like COBIT as the governance and management side of it, aligning around the framework gives them a way to do many compliance activities one time and use it to report and make sure that they're complying. So I think in that sense it has been successful, and it's been something that I've enjoyed working on, seeing many companies, especially the small business, saying that this is helping them to understand how to organize their response. And when they do organize that response and start taking activities, then use a more technical methodology. That might be the way that they go. But it is starting conversations, and I think that is part of its success. So with that, I think I'll leave that back over there. One other place that I can point to further discussion, we've been working with a number of organizations to stand up a place to continue this dialogue. We call that the C Forum, and that is at cyber.securityframework.org. And I think we could continue some lively discussion there. That would be interesting.
Thank you, Greg. So Chris, I'll throw up the questions if you don't mind, because there's a lot of interesting things that have been said. We've also received a lot of interesting questions from the audience, and we don't have a lot of time left, and these are tough issues. But one of the things, and I'll try and wrap one of the questions in here, both Terry and Jaap were talking about the framework being inadequate because it doesn't have any teeth, really, so to speak. It doesn't tell people what to do. There's no definition of what it means to comply with the framework, and there's no real way to measure it. And one of the questions was, in fact, that we received from the audience is, how do you develop some sort of way of quantifying or measuring how organizations are complying with the framework? Well, these issues came up during the workshop, and I think, Greg, you were there during all the workshops. And certainly at the beginning, there was quite a bit of pushback from the industry, from the critical infrastructure providers themselves, that NIST steered clear of any of that. They were very, very firm, very resistant to even using language in the framework documents that said anything to the effect that somebody should adopt this framework, because the term adoption seems to raise legal issues that nobody wanted that. So then there was the question of, all right, implement the framework, and that even created a lot of controversy. And so when this ultimately released its document, it used the term use the framework. So they steered clear of the language that a lot of the representatives there felt was too strong. And then there was the added question of, how could you come up with any very specific technical requirements or technical definitions when you're talking about having this framework stretch across 16 diverse sectors, from agriculture to energy to telecommunications. And then that sort of played out as this thing has been discussed in various arenas. For example, the FCC, Chairman Wheeler, came out with a fairly, I think, robust plan on how to get telecommunications providers to adopt the framework. And one of the things, some of the language that was used there was that telecommunications companies should develop metrics, and that telecommunications companies should prove that their adoption of the framework has had a demonstrably effective result in terms of helping cybersecurity. Well, that has created a huge amount of resistance among telecommunications companies. So I guess what I'm saying is that even though you're saying the framework is not useful, it's useless, and in the sense that it's really, you can drive a truck through its adoption, or no one's really, there's no definitions, what do you mean by this, and you can sort of conveniently drop this aspect of the framework or that aspect of the framework. It was the infrastructure providers themselves who objected to this having any kind of definitive teeth. And so I guess my question to the audience or to the panelists first of all is, what do you do when everyone gets together and says, we don't want you to be specific? And this was coming from the industries themselves, not from the government. I mean, NIST started off a little tougher than they ended up, and they did that as a result of the objections by the electric sector, by the telecommunications sector, by the financial sector. So is it possible to ever?
Yeah, not just by the organizations themselves, but also the SMEs. And so my quick comment, and a number of the questions have touched on these sort of things, is that two things. One, that what Jaap and Perry have described, and Perry and I have discussed this as well. Our Sarah project and Wright look kind of similar. A lot of these points are not reflected in existing standards. So if the government had taken the desired path, of some, and said that here's exactly what you'll do, they wouldn't have included a lot of the things that Perry and Jaap and I and others, here and on the panel and listening and out in the world would actually recommend doing, because really haven't been embedded and haven't gone through the years of standardization and into the kind of things that an organization like NIST could really address. But I don't think we can begin to overstate, though, the importance of this at the board level. I think cyber insurance is an enormous part of this. The boards are taking this more on as opposed to middle management, and the insurance companies, are very much moving the direction of making this your problem or theirs, and that allows the opportunity for the CGIs, for the Langners, for other organizations to implement things that the government never would have thought of. And so I think a lot of the onus has been placed on the SMEs, on the people who like a lot of the folks on the phone right here today, who know how this stuff is done, to work with getting this to the board level. One of the questions talked about the C-suite. That's exactly right. Perry touched on adding cost. Well, you can add cost and not do this if you risk having an incident, losing everything, or having premiums that reflect your lack of doing anything in the first place. So that's my thoughts anyways, and I'll leave the last couple minutes to the rest of the panel.
So Kevin, Terry, Greg, Jaap, any thoughts on, can you do a framework that has any kind of meaningful impact that stretches across anything other than one organization? I mean, can you come up with a comprehensive framework that someone's not going to object to? Kevin, you've done one very specifically for water that maps.
I think that the challenge and is kind of the scale or the level of capability that exists, and maybe it was Greg that talked about working at a co-op versus a large, from my perspective, I think part of the reason we push back on a much more kind of directed kind of regulatory approach was just the wide difference in the types and combinations of systems that exist just in our sector alone. And without giving folks an opportunity to embrace some of these kind of basic principles and make that, give them an opportunity to kind of acknowledge and understand the kind of the consequence of not doing some of these things. And I think it would be very, very difficult for the government to institutionalize a process that says, hey, you need to have, you know, strong password encryption, and if you don't, there's going to be a fine. How is that? The enforcement side of this becomes very complicated and challenging, and kind of defeats the primary purpose and objective. And it would tend towards compliance for the sake of compliance, and you may not get the security that you desire, as I think what Chris was alluding to. I think there's a maturity in the process here, and as automation has become more and more embedded, people gravitate to technologies without doing full life cycle analysis of, you know, the yin and the yang of these things. I see a lot of discussion about all the greatness of all this automation. I see very little kind of open discussion on the backside vulnerabilities, and I agree with what I think Perry and I believe Greg mentioned, is that there is an absence of a lot of detailed how, and that is a challenge that I have, is, you know, but at the same time, the how for a large urban water system like New York or Chicago is probably a little bit different than it is in, you know, Peoria or somewhere like that. I don't know that for a fact. You guys are I'm not the technology specialist per se, but I think greater resources on the how that enable people to do these things, and that doesn't mean they don't have to use some of the folks that are on the line to support them with that, but I think the more that they can empower the owner-operator to take action on this, I think one of the big issues is the thought that much of this is very costly and expensive. And so I think there may be some misconceptions about, you know, the level of effort needed to do some of the controls that will be appropriate. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that there is a lack of understanding of just what it takes. But I would think that at least the asset owners that I've interacted with, my best advice to them is don't look to the government to solve your problem, that you are already empowered because you're the asset owner. And if you simply choose not to do what's necessary or prudent, well, that's a business decision, and then you suffer the consequences. And the main issue that I have is that this framework was put together with the hope of, you know, getting people on this voluntary program, and perhaps that will work. And there's no doubt there are asset owners out there that are very diligent, that are really trying hard, and they're grabbing this framework and they're working hard to implement it and fill all those gaps between the what to do and actually how. But in the meantime, as folks need assistance in doing that, that's what we're trying to do. Is you know, our right framework is not trying to replace anything. It's just trying to really fill that gap and provide a measurable and scalable approach to implementing security that gives you the detailed how-to, the templates, the policies, the database schema. Everything is there. And so this is where I think that folks need the help is in that level of technical how-to. We've got the what has been floating up there for a long time. We all know what to do. We need to do better. Yes.
Terry, we're running out of time. I'm afraid of what will happen with this webinar system. I hope we don't get disconnected. I just don't mean to interrupt you. We've had quite a few questions from the audience. I don't think we're unfortunately going to get to all of them, but I did want to get one more question in before we wrap up the webinar.
Okay.
And because this has come in a couple of different forms, and one of the questions, and this is for all the panelists, is that one challenge, and we've all heard this, and we heard it during the workshops on the NIST framework and in lots and lots of press articles in the aftermath of Target and so forth, is that one challenge that companies have when it comes to cyber risk management is that the C-suite is not necessarily engaged. To what extent could the cybersecurity framework be used to help bring top leadership along in terms of prioritizing the cybersecurity risk? And I guess I'll toss that out to the group and let whoever wants to answer it first speak up, and then maybe add a couple of other panelist comments. But anyone have any thoughts on that? Has this been useful for the C-suite? Can it be used for the C-suite?
Yes, second. What I see, and I'm frequently invited at boardroom level, is when I show them, and I collect them now for years, all the incidents by industry sector worldwide that are published in the public domain, and show them how vulnerable their organizations are, and almost show them that they are already compromised without knowing that. If you show the risks, if you show the incidents that have already happened in the past and are happening today, then they really realize that they need to take action from an executive perspective for their organizations. It's showing what is going on in real life.
I would just add to that, as far as the framework specifically, it's another thing you
bring to the C-suite. This is Greg, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Now this is Chris.
I'm sorry, Chris.
Okay. Just the framework is another indicator to bring to the C-suite. Say, look, the U.S. federal government is taking this very seriously, and someone like any of the panelists here, as Jappe say, you can fill in those gaps for them. Say, you're being told you need to do these things. You can expect to have responsibility for them. There's all sorts of detail that's not even in here as part of it. So I see the real value of the framework, as Perry said, or as I said, maybe Perry might have not disagreed at least, that it's not horrible, which it could have been. That it's a statement from on high that can get the attention of C-suite executives. So it's not a bunch of engineers coming to them and telling them they should do things. Or it's not someone coming just to sell them security services, saying, look, this is important at every level. You can expect to be held responsible for it. You can assume that risk if you choose, or you can do something about it. And that's the real value. So we are over time, but the webinar won't close, and there's still a fair number of people here, so the panel wants to keep talking for a while. We'll keep it open and keep going.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it's just sort of like the timer runs out and then we're gone. Anyone have any other thoughts on the C-suite question?
Yeah, this is Kevin. I think that's part of the reason why we would have developed the guidance we developed had the executive order come out or not. That was already in motion, and it just happened to coincide with the executive order. So that helped add a little bit of lift to it. And I think the framework, though, in and of itself, does not speak C-suite language. It's very abstract. It doesn't speak their language. And I'm not saying that our guidance gets any further towards that, but it does contextualize it in the sense of, how this issue is applied in our sector and what some of these different principles actually mean. And but I think the no regrets analysis, or not to say, a lot of the conversation comes out as, somebody from China is going to come hack your system, and 9 times out of 10, most folks in a small community are going to be like, why would they be interested in me? And they don't, they translate it from the difference between physical proximity to kind of do a malevolent attack versus the virtual nature of a cyber system, which doesn't require proximity. That's a difficult thing to overcome, and so I think that's one challenge, and I think the document doesn't quite get to that point of normalizing this in a way that makes it approachable. The how part is a really critical thing in kind of making it, not oversimplifying it, but making it so folks, given the spectrum of systems that this applies to, can feel like they can take action on it without, spending a gazillion dollars.
All right. Let's see, since we have quite a few people still on the webinar and we have permission to go over time, I have another question from the audience. And this, I kind of referenced this at the beginning, but it's worth going back to, which is, does anyone want to address how are companies that are using the framework measuring its impact? At this stage, it's only been 6 months, but how can they tell if their usage if the usage of the cybersecurity framework is actually improving cybersecurity? Does anybody have any insight into what's really going on out there in terms of measuring any changes as a result of the framework, or is it too soon?
Well, I would say, I can tell you that there's been a significant uptake on our side in folks accessing, is more appropriate, our guidance and tool. What they do, the results of that is a little more difficult for me to assess, given some of the sensitivities that a utility might have. But I think it's a little bit premature to ask that question, but we do anticipate doing a survey of folks to find how they've done some things, maybe not specifically, whether or not they've implemented a control, but a little bit more generically how they've applied some of the principles put in place.
Anyone else, any thoughts?
This is Greg. One thing I'm hearing, and I kind of alluded to it before, many organizations are trying to understand how to weave it into their 2015 audit plans, how it will play a role in what they'll be auditing and what specific processes they'll be doing. Hopefully it'll be with specific assessment criteria, but it's being integrated with things like SOX and NIST and HIPAA and NPI and PCI, all the different compliance frameworks that are there. It's actually starting to become something to which each of those different compliance pieces can anchor to. So it's not meant to replace them, but it's meant to provide a commonality that they can start doing some common measurement against.
Chris, any further thoughts or questions that you want to raise? I guess we're just a tiny bit over. Any other comments that you have before we wrap up the webinar and turn it over to Debbie?
No, I think I've said my piece. It's been an interesting view from the multiple perspectives. And I guess if I was going to say anything, I'd just sort of reiterate. This was, we had a couple possible paths. We can see how it could be worse in a lot of directions. And I think the onus goes back to those of us who actually know what to do and how to do it, to see that that's done and leverage what we can. As Perry said, the government can't solve this problem for you. And in other countries, whose systems are completely different, maybe they can. But I think that was a mountain too high, for the current effort and the time frame. A year is sort of ridiculously short for the federal government to do anything. So we're, it's back on us again. It's not, it hasn't become any less of a threat. We have, as always, extreme concerns. These systems are extremely vulnerable. We suffer from that all jointly, if the worst case we were worried about happens. And I just see some hope in the fact that, the C-suites and the boards are beginning to recognize some of that pressure as well.
All right. Well, I guess with that, you have the last word, Chris. I want to thank Kevin and Perry and Greg and Yop for taking the time today to talk about this really interesting and important topic, I assume. And I believe that we'll continue to keep you informed as things progress. And I want to thank all the attendees who spent the time listening to these experts and getting some sort of a grip on what's going on with the NIST framework. And thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Debbie.
To our distinguished panelists, thank you so much for your thoughts and insights that you've shared on today's call. And to our audience, on behalf of all of us at the ICS-ISAC and DCT Associates, we appreciate your joining us today. We hope that you found the information of value and something that you can take to further enhance your organization's cybersecurity posture. As a reminder, a recording of this session will be available on the ICS-ISAC.org briefing archive page, as well as on the digitalcrazytown.com blog page. Thank you again for your participation on today's call.